All right, good evening. How you guys doing? I feel like I'm a long way from you. Like this is like a Baptist church. All right. Everybody's sitting in the back. You know what the difference between a Baptist and a Presbyterian is? Presbyterian will say hi to you at the liquor store. Anyway, all right. So I'm not sure why that came to my mind, but it did. All right, so we're going to pray and we're going to get started talking about Buddhism and Hinduism tonight. And next month we'll actually we're kind of working. If you were here last was it December, November was our last one. We looked at the Abrahamic religions, so looked at Islam, also looked at a little closer at Judaism, right? And so if you missed that, it's available on our YouTube channel. You can find that, watch all the theology for everyone's we've ever done are on there. So if you've ever missed one, you want to go back and see any of them, they're there. So, and likewise tonight, for people who missed it tonight, it'll be there as well. So, all right, well, let's pray and we will get started. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for your goodness and your mercy to us. Thank you for the gift of curiosity. Thank you that you made us in a way to want to know more about you, more about ourselves, more about the way things exist. And so, Father, I'm a huge believer that according to your word that you reward those who diligently seek you. And I believe you also reward those who diligently seek truth in every capacity. And so, Father, as we try to better understand the way the world operates, the way it was created, the way that you sustain and maintain sovereignty over it, and also we want to better understand our other humans. How do we relate to one another? How do we interact with each other? How do we best understand those who may be different from us in a way that we can hopefully invite them towards your goodness? And so, Father, as we study these things and talk about them tonight, will you just guide the conversation? And in all of this, will you be glorified? Let our primary life, everything about us, may it serve to glorify you. Lord, it's in the beautiful and the powerful name of your Son, Jesus, I pray. Amen and amen. All right. So before we get into Hinduism, we started the reading plan this week, and I know this is not part of our agenda, but that's all right. I have the mic, so I can kind of go where I want to a little bit, I guess. If you read Genesis 1 through 15 or 1 through 16 this week, any questions out of that? Nothing? There's some weird stuff in there, right? Well, there's a lot of stuff in Genesis that I wonder about, man. The Nephilim, like the giants, things like, when God cast them out of the garden, right? Cain and Abel, they take wives. Where did those people come from? Right? There were people outside the garden, it seems like, before. It's all kinds of interesting stuff to me. So anyway. Well, you guys have no questions about it. You figured it out. That's good. You're way ahead of me on it, so I'll ask you guys some questions later about it because there's some stuff I don't get there. All right, it's cool. So let's talk about Hinduism. What do you know about Hinduism? What do you know?
Polytheistic.
Okay, polytheistic. Anybody else? Polytheistic meaning what? Anybody know? Everybody got that? Meaning many gods, right? Like so, poly, many, theistic. Theist, right, is God. So many gods. Anything else? It is what we would consider an Eastern religion, right? It comes out of the East, which basically all religions, major religions came out of the East. Some of them just moved a little west, and we kind of co-opted them a little bit better. But so we would consider it an Eastern religion for sure. Anybody else? There is a caste system, right, that's worked within the system itself, within the religion a little bit itself. So, yeah, absolutely. Which has a huge effect on places that it's a dominant religion, right, in the way that it works out sociologically and all those things. So, yeah, a caste system. Anything else? Okay, so some of the gods, right, some of the deities. And we'll talk a little bit about who those deities are, what their kind of perceived roles are, and personalities, all those kind of things. All right, so we'll get into it then. So let me just give you a sense of this too. Last week we talked about Islam, we talked about Judaism. Obviously we are Christian. And so worldwide, I want to give you just kind of a sense of how many people follow these religions. So, what's the most followed religion in the world? Or has the most adherents? Anybody have any idea? It is Christianity. So Christianity has about 2.5 billion adherents worldwide out of a little bit over 8 billion people. So a little more than a quarter, somewhere between a quarter and a third of all people on earth identify as Christian in some sense, right? So Christianity would be number one. Number two would be Islam. So Islam is about 1.9, so it's almost 2 billion, and it's growing pretty rapidly. A lot of that's through birth rate. One of the things about most Christian nations is that our birth rates are really low, and so that is a challenge moving forward in a lot of ways, and perpetuating Christianity is that, especially in the West, and in the Far East even, like in Japan, most of Asia. I don't know if you guys know this, but there's only one continent on Earth where the birth rates are high enough to sustain growth population-wise right now. Do you know which continent it is? Africa. Every other continent, birth rates are not at a point where they're able to sustain population moving forward. So, and that has nothing to do with Hinduism or Buddhism, but it's just interesting to me. So yeah, number two would be Islam. Number three, Hinduism. So Hinduism is about 1.01 billion people, largely in one or two countries, right? It happens to be one of the largest nations on earth is predominantly Hindu. So number three would be Hindu. Number four would be Buddhism. So Buddhism is about 530 million worldwide. And then the last major religion we talked about, Judaism. You have any guesses how many people are Jewish or who identify as Jewish in the world in terms of religion? A little bit over 14 million. So I want you to just think about those numbers. Buddhism is the fourth largest religion in the world, 530 million. Judaism, about 14.8 million. So we tend to think that there are a lot more people who are Jewish in the world than actually are. So that's just an interesting number to me, right? How big a disparity there is between number four and then Judaism, which is number five, right? That kind of goes off pretty quickly there. Actually, number five would be agnosticism, right? People who just say, I don't know. So quite a few of them. All right, so let's talk about Hinduism just a little bit. Hinduism is probably, along with Judaism, one of the oldest established religions that is still practiced. In the U.S., there are a couple that are older, they're a little bit smaller scale, but we can trace the roots of Hinduism back about 4,000 years. So it's about 4,000 years old, somewhere in that neighborhood. It derived largely about 2,500 BC in the Indus Valley among something called the Indus Valley Civilization, which is on the Indian subcontinent, right? So that part of the world on the Indian subcontinent. The earliest writings that we have within Hinduism would be some of the Vedas, which date to about 1500 BC. So we have writings that at least we can trace back at some level to about 3,500 years ago that are associated with Hinduism, right? Some of the original texts, the Vedas, within Hinduism. It has evolved in many, many ways, as anything would over that span of time. And I would say it's one of those that, even though we refer to it as a religion, it's really probably more of a philosophy of life than a codified religion, right? It certainly has religious practice, religious beliefs within it, but it's a little bit more of a codified belief or a kind of a philosophical belief system than it is a codified religion in many ways. All right? So sacred texts within Hinduism. There are two main categories within Hindu text. The first are called Shruti, and that comes from a word that means heard. So these are, when you hear that, these are the texts that they believe came straight from deity, right? These are the words or the texts that were given from a deity. So Shruti is the one type. The second would be Smriti, which comes from a word meaning remember. So those are the things that are remembered, right? So those are not necessarily divine in that they came straight from some sort of deity, the universe, whatever. But they are they come alongside and they support the other text in many ways, right? So within the Shruti text, you would have things like the Vedas. You would have another kind of class of that called the Upanishada. And again, those Vedas, the Upanishad, right, are what they would consider divine text, right? They fall within that kind of classification of Shruti. And if you've heard of any of those, maybe the Vedas, anybody have heard of the Vedas before? Right? That's probably the one that people are most familiar with. So within the Smriti texts, those tend to be more like epics, right? So they're kind of stories, these great stories and epics that are meant to guide people philosophically. So you have things like the Mahabharata, right? And my Farsi is not great, right? In fact, I don't know any, so I'm just trying to pronounce these the best that I can. So you may not know the Mahabharata itself, but you might know something that is within it. The Bhagavad Gita, right? So if you've heard of any Hindu text, it might be that one, right? The Bhagavad Gita. There are others within that kind of a classification as well. The Ramayana. And the one that really stands out, if you've not heard of it, it really is probably of primary importance with Hinduism, is the Bhagavad Gita. And it's a primary philosophical guide for practitioners within Hinduism, people who are adherents of Hinduism. So those are some of the guiding texts for them. Let's get into a couple of core beliefs, all right? So we're going to introduce a couple of concepts. Some of them you may have heard of, some of them maybe not. But the first one I want to talk a little bit about is the concept of Sanatana Dharma, which literally means eternal duty. So it's kind of this guiding principle of what it means to be human within Hinduism. That everybody is part of this kind of, or has a sense of this idea that we're all kind of moving in the same direction, trying to work towards the same kind of outcomes, right? So this idea that we all have a duty placed upon us as we exist. And so it's a guiding principle there, the Dharma. Next would be what you may have heard, the belief in Brahman, which is kind of the ultimate formless reality, right? Brahman's not so much a god as it is just existence itself, right? And so this idea that we're all part of this thing, the Brahman, right? Like that every person is kind of part of this uniting spirit or reality, if you will. So if the Brahman is kind of the overarching existence, the next concept is something called Atman, right? Which is the idea of the individual soul. So it's every being, which itself is a manifestation of Brahman, right? So the souls are not autonomous. They are kind of a manifestation or an outworking of this universal reality, this universal kind of existence. I think it entails every living thing in some sense, right? So for instance, within Hinduism, you have sacred animals, right? Cows are sacred within Hinduism. A large percentage of people who practice Hinduism are vegan, so they don't eat animals, right? So a lot of that has to do with this concept that everything, every living soul, or every living being, let me say it that way, it has a manifestation of this within it, right? So we're all kind of, we're connected in that way, right? All right, so within that, you have some ideas or some concepts. Karma, which is the one that we've heard about, right, probably, right? So what does karma refer to? actions and consequences, right? Actions have consequences. Not just in the moment, but they eternally have consequence, right? Not just in this life, but in the lives that come, right? If you are a not really good person in this life, that's going to have consequences in the next one, right? And the next one, and the next one. So we'll get into that. So karma would be this concept of like actions and consequence, right? That the universe operates on that principle, right? That everything that happens has a consequence to it, or an opposite kind of reaction, if you will, in that way, right? So that's karma. Then we have dharma, which is, we mentioned this a little bit earlier. What does dharma mean? Anybody remember? It's duty, right? A duty to work for the good of all things, right? That I'm not this disconnected autonomous being that's completely separate from everything else, and I'm just using everything else for my good. Like, I'm connected to it all, right? And in that way, my duty is to work for the good of all things in some capacity, right? Moksha, right? Which is the concept of being liberated ultimately from the cycle of rebirth. So within Hinduism, you're trying to work to get out of the cycle of rebirth towards like true kind of nirvana, right? Being completely one with the Brahman again, right? The universe, really, or that kind of external reality. And so ultimately, when you reach that, it's the concept of moksha, that I eventually working to get out of this cycle of rebirth. Because every rebirth is an opportunity to kind of fix some things, to do some things differently than they were done previously. And ultimately, you're working to get out of that, all right? And then that concept, that cycle itself is called samsara, right? The cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. And so within Hinduism, you can come back. Chuck, you asked about the concept of the soul, right? The individual kind of autonomous soul, right? So one of the beliefs, depending within the kind of, and again, when we talk about Hinduism, it's kind of like talking about Christianity. It's not a monolith, right? Within it, you have different systems of belief, just like we would, right? I was talking to somebody on their way out today, and she had only ever gone to Episcopal churches, and so she came to our service today, and she's like, "What was that? What were you guys doing?" I'm like, "Yeah, I get it. Like, I didn't have on any vestments, right? Like, yeah, it was probably different for you, right?" And we were just talking about the idea of how, like, you can have different expressions with very similar beliefs. We can hold very similar beliefs, but the expression of those things can look very different, and that's okay, right? So you have that within all these religions at some level, right? There are different expressions. Some people are more conservative in their ideology, their theology surrounding it. Some are more progressive too. So you have that within this as well, right? But it's back to that idea that there are within Hinduism like belief structures that you can be reincarnated, not necessarily as a person, but in other forms of life, right? So, like, there are, so if you think about it, like, they tend to hold life in a different way than we do sometimes, right? Because you're not exactly sure what that life fully is, but you know that it's connected to everything in a way that matters, right? And so there's a little bit of that within that core belief system, right? So let's talk about some of the deities, or what we would consider deities, I guess, in Hinduism. As we talked about earlier, it's polytheistic by nature with millions of deities. Right? Nobody knows how many there are. Right? And there are different levels of deity within the belief system, right? Some are like kind of more localized. You have kind of overarching deities that we'll talk about just a little bit. So they have something called the Trimurti, which would be similar to kind of the Trinity in some capacity, right? Except that it's made up of three separate gods, not one God in three persons, but it is a Trinity for them, a triumvirate for them, right? And those are made, so that the Trimurti is made up of three deities. The first would be Brahma, who is the creator God. So Brahma's a creator. The second would be Vishnu. And Vishnu is the preserver, so the one who basically sustains life. So you have Brahma the creator, Vishnu the preserver. Anybody know the third one? The destroyer, who is named Shiva. So Shiva's the destroyer. So if you think about the cycle that we talked about earlier, samsara, that cycle, it has three components, right? What's the first part of the cycle? Birth. What's the second? Life. What's the third one? Death. So if you think about that, it aligns with the gods themselves, right? Brahma, the creator, the life giver. Vishnu, the preserver, the one who sustains life. And then you have Shiva, the destroyer, death, right? So you see that cycle even reflected within the gods themselves, right? Or life reflects the gods. Might be a better way to look at that from that perspective. All right, so those would be kind of overarching deities. You have other popular deities like Lakshmi, Parvati, Ganesh, Hanuman, right? And all of them have different roles, different places, kind of a pantheistic sense in some ways, right? They have different responsibilities, roles. You also have, as we said, millions maybe, based on the region, the communities, right? So you may go from one village and they have a set of gods. You go to a next village over, it's not exactly the same, right? Same overarching belief system largely, but different deities. And that is actually not unique. Historically, that's actually pretty much the way most religions exist. Right? If you were to go back among the Greeks, among the Mesopotamians, even the Romans, right? You guys, so have you ever watched a Gladiator, the movie? So when Maximus is praying to the ancestors, right? I don't know if you ever paid attention to those scenes, but Maximus, the main character, before he goes to where he's praying to the ancestors. And so you would go into a Roman home and they would have a shrine room set up, basically, if they had any wealth to them especially. And they would have they would have a shrine set up and they would have these little figurines almost. These figurine gods, right? And every house would have different ones, right? Reminiscent of their ancestors, but within the Roman system, every community would have a different god, basically, right? You'd have gods that were just gods over a bridge, right? This bridge is protected by so-and-so. So most religious systems throughout history have been polytheistic, but in a way that, like, even within that religion, people believed in different gods, right? And a lot of them were based on where they lived, all those kind of things. So communities had a god, even down to household level at times. So actually within Hinduism, the idea that you have a lot of gods within the system is actually pretty common in terms of the historical nature of religion, right? So those are some of the deities. Before we get into kind of the goals of life within Hinduism, any questions or any observations? Anything? I think we can hear Chuck. Actually, you know what? We do have people watching online. So if you don't mind using the mic, I'd appreciate it. So thanks for reminding me about that, Chuck. I'd forgotten. There it goes.
It made me think of the little figurines of Jacob's father-in-law had that terrapin or whatever it was.
Laban, was that Laban?
Laban, yeah, I couldn't think of his name. Is that similar to that, or what was that about?
Yeah, I think a lot of ancient religions. When I say ancient, I'm thinking time period 1000, 2000 BC. A lot of them were tied to like ancestor worship, right? Mm-hmm. That the ancestors now protected those that they left behind, right? You see that within like African animistic religions even, right? This idea of the ancestors are watching over us, and we have a duty to live in a way that honors them, right? And if we do that and we ask them, they will work for us, right? So I think that's a pretty common historical component of most religions, right? Especially because if you think about it, most religions have not been global very long, right? Most religions existed within very narrow, or at least narrow in terms of a global perspective, regions for most of their existence, right? And most of the religions that have come and gone existed in very small spaces, right? At the most, part of a continent, something like that. So only within the last 200 or 300 years have we really had the mobility so that religions could largely move continent to continent, right? Which is one of the things that makes Christianity pretty amazing, honestly, right? That they were moving this continent to continent within 100 years of its creation, when it was hard to go continent to continent, right? It was challenging. And so I think when we think of these like global religions, we think there have always been some global religions. That's just not true historically. Most religions were local, right? And most gods were relatively local. And a lot of them worked through the idea of ancestor worship, those kind of things, right? So, and up until relatively recently. And like we said, if you were to go to just about any continent on earth outside North America and Western Europe, you still see a lot of like small religious practices and religious kind of systems that are tied to where they are, right? They don't move away from it. They're very localized. And I think about that, if you think about it, we see that even with Catholicism, right? The idea of saints that are tied to locations, or they're tied to all of those kind of things. So I think a lot of that permeates from earlier periods, and it still exists in that way, right? Our concept of this kind of like global religion that just has one God and is pretty unique. As unique as it can be when it's practiced by 2.5 billion people. You know what I mean? But historically, that's a really, really different kind of religion. Religions didn't exist that way, and many still don't. So yeah, I think that's an interesting thing about Christianity to me. It's a huge differentiator that I think sometimes we miss because we've only known this. So we kind of miss that the rest of the world, this hasn't existed very long at all, right? It's really new for them. So anyway, all right. Anything else before we kind of get to some of the goals of life within Hinduism? Cool. All right, let's talk. So we're going to talk about kind of what are considered the 4 goals of life within Hinduism. All right. So the word for this is purushartha, and it kind of goes in sequence, right? So the first of those would be dharma, which is again duty, the duty to live righteously, to recognize your connection to everything else and what you do impacts everything else, right? You have a duty beyond yourself. And I think we can all agree that's probably a pretty good value, right? To recognize that we don't live just for ourselves, right? And so that is a guiding principle within Hinduism, right? This idea of we have a duty to others, duty to everything, all right? So first is dharma. Number 2 would be artha, right? To work towards prosperity and success, to work towards a life well lived, right? That your life is productive in some sense, right? That you kind of end your life with more than you started with, right? Because life is tangible at some level too. It's not just theoretical, right? And so this idea of I'm working to try to become prosperous and successful, to have lived a life well lived. So we have dharma, we have artha. Number 3 would be kama, K-A-M-A. And that's to live a life of pleasure and enjoyment. So in other words, we're not just meant to suffer through this life. We're meant to also enjoy the fact that we have it, right? That as bad as life is, you can still find some things to enjoy, some things to be grateful for, right? Take time to enjoy life, if you will, right? So we have dharma, we have duty, we have artha, this concept of working to build. Kama, this idea of like recognizing that life is meant to be enjoyed as well. And then number 4, moksha, which we talked about earlier, that we're working through all of these things to kind of be liberated from the cycle of life and death and to return, in some sense, kind of to the Brahman. So if those are the 4 goals of this kind of philosophical or religious system, what are the pros and cons that you can see in that? If my life is built around these 4 things, right? Duty, hard work, trying to become successful, right? Prosperous, right? Pursuing pleasure and enjoyment, but also trying to work out of this cycle of life and death, right? To return to the Brahman. What are some challenges in pursuing life that way, or what are maybe some benefits to it? Anybody? Okay. All right. How is it selfish? Well, I would say within the Dharma it does. Because your duty is beyond yourself, it's to everything, right? For the good of everything. Because you recognize the idea of karma is that what I do affects not just me, but it affects everything else, right? So I think there is a sense of connection beyond self within it. And it certainly could be selfish, I think, but I don't think it is by definition necessarily. I think that the idea of duty is the duty to not yourself, but it's beyond you, right? And not everybody lives that out well, I'm sure, but yeah, I can see that it could become that way. I don't know that it functionally works that way within the belief system itself, but yeah, it's a good thought. Anybody else? Dependent upon you? Okay, absolutely. Right? Yeah, absolutely. Right? I'm kind of given these things I'm supposed to live by, but then it's like, all right, go do this now. And you'll keep doing it till you get it right. Right? Like the beatings will continue until morale improves. You know what I mean? Kind of thing, right? Like, it's ultimately, you're working towards eliminating suffering. To remove yourself from it, to eliminate it throughout everything, right? But it is dependent upon you largely, right? And so, yeah, it's pretty works-based in that way. And there's a selfishness in that, too, back to what Will was saying, too, right? That I am kind of the determiner of my success, right? Nobody else, right? Yes, ma'am? That's all right. Just throw it out there. Yep. Mhm. Yeah, I think coming from where we come from, it's hard to believe, right? I think if you were born in southern India, in a small village, and all you knew was what you were told, and a lot of it was from a concept of Hindu, right? It would be hard to believe that there were people in America who believed that there weren't a lot of gods. There was just one God. And so, sure. Yeah. So it's a good question, right? I think the way that I think God sees it, and I don't want to speak for him. I don't. Um, but I try to put myself in his place for a second if I can to think about the way maybe he thinks about it. And again, that's flawed. I get it. But it goes back to what we talked about even looking at Genesis 1 this morning, right? God creates this world, or at least he brings order to the world. And he starts this new story of wanting to have interaction with people, a being who's made in his image, wanting to have a relationship with it. And so he creates this perfect existence where everything should be fine. And immediately, what do people do? They go their own way. Right? That the only thing we have to do is submit to God and trust him. That's the only thing we have to do. And it's the one thing we don't want to do. We want to do everything else. Right? And so, if you think about that, if humans have existed for, tens of thousands of years, let's say, just think about how much that concept has multiplied over the generations. How what started as a creator God, Yahweh, right, who created this thing and designed people and tasked them with going and representing him in the world and stewarding all that was created. How, one of the interesting things I think when you look at religions, no matter where you find them, all of them have some elements of truth to them. All of them have some elements of truth. So what does that say about them? What it says to me about them, and this is just the way I look at it and interpret it, right, is that over time, do you ever when you were in like elementary school play like that, the telephone game? You sit in a circle and the teacher or whoever starts off and they whisper like a phrase or whatever, a sentence into the ear of the person next to them. And then you have to go around the circle and by the end of it, invariably what has happened? Yeah, it's not, yeah. If there's one word the same, you're doing really well. So imagine that as human existence. Imagine that at the beginning, God creates this thing. And every generation since has been whispering about it. You're going to have a lot of different perspectives on things by the end of it. Does that make sense? Now, does that make all of them true? No. I think God still holds to this, the way it was designed to be, the way it is. But it means along the way, there's a whole lot of people who have concepts of God that may hold some truth about him, but they miss the whole of who he is. And I think what God does is he grieves over that. I think he grieves over it. And I think what he did then, and this is why Christianity makes sense to me, rather than trying to just work through humans to make it all right, because the Old Testament is full of him trying to work through humans to make it all right. And humans just going, we're bad at this. So what does he do then? This is where Christianity is different from all these other religious systems. God steps in, becomes human, and he takes the punishment of the humans. He doesn't just tell them, do better. He makes us a way for us to be reconciled to God. That's the difference. That is the difference. Right? Every religion has some moral truths to it. Every religion has some people who practice it who are walking morally in ways that are good. Christianity is the only one that God steps in and intervenes and makes a way absent what we could do. And I think that is worth thinking about for people, right? Not here to throw stones at other belief systems. I think a lot of them are full of people trying to figure out what's true, right? But if all things are true, nothing is. If all ways are equal, there is no way then. right? And so I think we have to approach people of different belief systems. I think number one, let's be curious, right? I don't know if you like one-sided conversations. I don't. I don't like to talk to people who just tell me things. I like dialogue, right? I think most of us are built that way. And we shouldn't be people who just go to everybody else and say, well, let me tell you why you're wrong. We should be people who listen a little bit. And it's really one of the reasons we do these kind of nights is because somewhere along the way, you're going to meet someone who's Hindu. Somewhere along the way, you might have a conversation with someone who's Buddhist. You don't have to understand everything about their practice and their religious system. But wouldn't it be cool that you at least spend an hour or two trying to understand them a little bit better? Like, doesn't that say something? I think it does. And so yeah, working through this, I think we would do a disservice to say that there are not things within all of these belief systems that ring true. Practices, whatever. They just don't, they can't get us to God in the way that Jesus can. They just can't. Right? And so I think God grieves over everyone who has not found their way back to him through Jesus. And I think our duty, back to the idea of duty, what is our duty? Our duty is to make the goodness of God unavoidable. Right? Through the proclamation and the living of the gospel.
Can I throw this in?
Absolutely you can.
Where exactly, I would have to say the United States somewhere, did Christianity actually, it was born, I mean, I know the story about God's the creator and stuff,
Sure.
but in how Christianity worships him, do you know that? Was it in our country?
No, our country was way late in that. I mean, the earliest writings we have of a post-resurrection church are within about 20 years of Jesus' death. Right, so it happened immediately, basically. It's one of the interesting things about Christianity especially is that it's probably the best recorded of all the major religions in terms of having actual writings relatively close to happening. And so, yeah, Christianity is 2,000 years old, or at least really close to that, right? So we're not as old as Hinduism, right? But if you think about it, Christianity comes out of a Jewish belief system, right? In that the Messiah himself was Jewish, right? And Jesus would have seen himself as Jewish, right? In fact, he practiced Judaism, right? But there was something that happened with the Messiah that changed things, right? And so, yeah. So Christianity was going a whole long time before the United States came around. And we've done our thing with it. So some good and some bad for sure, like everybody. But yeah. But I will say one of the reasons that Christianity is probably the largest practiced religion in the world, a lot of that growth has been within the last 120, 130 years. And a lot of that is because of missions work out of the United States, especially in the early 1900s, right? That the U.S. sent tens of thousands of missionaries all around the world, as did England and some other countries in Western Europe. And so I will say, even though the U.S. is relatively late in the whole scope of Christianity, it has been a huge mechanism in the growth of Christianity globally in the last 150 years, probably. So a lot of that, for sure. All right. So somebody asked earlier about the caste system and how that fits within Hinduism, so let's talk just a little bit about that. So the system itself is something called Varna, V-A-R-N-A. And historically, it started as kind of based on occupational roles within society. All right? And so within the Varna system, you basically have 4 levels of Varna, or 4 types of Varnas. You have the Brahmins, who are the priests. That's the priestly caste, right? The Brahmins. You have the Kshatriyas, which originally they were the warrior class, right? You have the Vaishyas, who were the merchant class. And then you have the Shudras, who were the laborers, right? Now, that's the way that caste system kind of historically developed. It has evolved and it differs from place to place, right? So, it's become much more socioeconomic in India than it was to begin with, right? And so, the way that kind of plays out within society, especially in India itself, and predominantly Hindu India, is based around socioeconomics. It's based around birth family, all of those kind of things. So if you think about it as Americans, we always think like, if you work hard enough, you can work your way up. That's not really the way it works within a caste system. You are largely defined by your birth family and your birth situation. Right? And this is kind of the sinister part of this belief system, is that because they believe it's tied to this religious system, that the caste system you were born in, you basically deserve that. That's a result of karma. Right? So you need to suffer if you're suffering. So if you think about it, so Mother Teresa, right, decides she's going to go to Calcutta and she's going to minister among what they call the untouchables. Well, why do they call them the untouchables? Because nobody in India was touching that. Yeah. And they're rejected because everybody else believes they deserve the suffering. You're being punished for what you did. In a past life, deal with it. You need to live that. Why would I help you? Right? Why would I? It's not my responsibility. Like this is your penance now, in some sense, right? This is how you learn. This is how you move forward, right? And so that's why, like, there is a tremendous amount of suffering and economic disparity within India, largely, right? And some of that is connected to this belief system, this idea that people kind of get what they get, right? And it's not my responsibility necessarily to undo that for you, right? And so that's how the religious affects kind of the culture itself, the society itself in many ways, right? And so you can see how that might build animosity within the Hindu community a little bit. Resentment, envy, all these kind of things that would naturally come along with that, right? So that's kind of the Varna, the caste system. And as we said, it deviates from place to place, region to region a little bit. It's not always the same. But there's this belief that, like, people are at a station in life for a reason, right? And it's nobody else's responsibility to move you beyond that, right? If you want to be in a better caste, guess what? Live in the one that you're in well, right? And when you come back, hopefully you move up, right? So there's some harshness to that. There's some harshness to the way that people see other people and their suffering at times, right? It can be very easily dismissed in many ways, right? All right, so let's talk a little bit about some Hindu practices. Some daily practices. You get things like puja, which is their version of worship, right? So going to a shrine, that kind of thing. Making offerings, right, at times to whatever deity you're offering to. Things that we know that kind of derived from Hindu practice, right, and are still part of it in many ways. Yoga, so that is not an American development, right? We just found better ways to make money at it, which is our skill, right? A way to commodify things. But that yoga is actually an ancient practice that was used to bring the body into kind of discipline, right? To kind of work towards being able to be attuned to the universe in some sense, right? Obviously, meditation is a huge part of Hindu practice, right? Kind of being able to center so that you can kind of hear from the divine, those kind of things. There are like major festivals and rituals in Hinduism, things like Diwali, Holi, Navaratri. There are holy places within Hinduism, and so there are pilgrimages that people will often take, mostly within India itself. So you get pilgrimages to places like Varanasi, Rishikesh, Tirupati, and so pilgrimages to go to a holy place, to make a journey, to come to those places is part of practice as well. Hindu worship and practice does tend to be very like familial, community-based. We talked about communities often have like their own kind of pantheon of gods, right? And so there is a strong familial and communal aspect to it, right? As there would be if you believed that you were connected to all things, right? And so there is a huge part of that as well. Philosophy, this kind of willingness to sit down and think about what it means to exist, has long been a huge part of Hinduism, right? In fact, there are 6 classical schools of Hindu philosophy, and a lot of things that you can read if you're interested in reading some of that. So those 6 classical schools of Hindu philosophy would be Jnana, Vaisheshika, and I'm sure I mispronounced that, Samkhya, Yoga, Mimamsa, and Vedanta. And so there are a lot of philosophical writings within the Hindu framework, if you will. And then kind of modern Hinduism, to kind of wrap this up before we kind of move on to Buddhism just a little bit. Obviously, colonialism, especially the British Empire in India, had a massive effect on Hindu practice at times, right? The British largely tried to restrict it and subjugate it, right, as a means of control during the kind of peak colonial periods. And largely the leaders of liberation within India were Hindus, right? And were driven by belief and practice and those kind of things, that it really became a liberation movement for them in many ways. People like Gandhi, right, were strongly driven by this idea of the importance of all people, right? The equality of people in terms of we're all kind of in this thing together, if you will. And so Hindu ideas had a large place in bringing liberation to the Indian people in the early 1900s and throughout the last century. So, and obviously, one of the things that has happened is Hinduism has become global, right? As people have moved out of that part of the world where it was largely localized for most of its existence, as people have moved to other countries to take jobs, things like that, it's gone with them, right? And so even some of the things we talked about today, we may not have known what they were, but we've heard these words. How did we hear them? largely people who've moved into our countries, right, or into the U.S. or to the West and have brought some of these ideas and practices with them. So, and that is actually increasing, it's not decreasing. So it's good for us to at least have some familiarity with it, I think. All right? So that is 4,000 years of practice in about 58 minutes. So we obviously did not cover everything relating to Hinduism, but I hope at least that's a little bit of a primer to make you curious. Because at the end of the day, I hope you guys know what these nights are. They're just to make you curious enough that if you really want to figure what out these things are, to go really on your own and say, hey, I want to know more about this, right? And if you ever have questions about how do I find out more about these things after nights like this, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'll be glad to give you some resources, or at least point you in some directions. All right? Any questions about Hinduism before we kind of move to Buddhism? No? Okay. All right, so let's talk about Buddhism. What do you know about Buddhism?
I always thought of it as an Asian,
Yeah.
Oriental practice.
It does come from that part of the East, largely, right? And so we'll talk a little bit about it. It comes from very similar places to Hinduism, right? They originated in very close proximity to one another, and they have had conflicts amongst themselves in that part of the world. But both, just like Hinduism, it is what we would consider an Eastern religion, I guess. So, yep. Anything else? Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Like if you ever go in Home Goods, they always have a couple of Buddhas, right? Like that you can buy for the backyard. It's funny. I've seen Buddhas in people's yards who are not Buddhist. You know what I mean? Like it's like I just like the statue. It was cool. That guy looks like he's having a good time. There you go. There you go. Like we are multicultural. You know what I mean? Anything else? All right, so that's why we're doing these. All right, so maybe we'll learn a little bit here and there along the way. So let's talk about the origins of Buddhism first. As far as we know, as far as it can be traced, it originated in about the 5th to 6th century BC in India. So ancient, old, right? These practices and these principles, very old. So founded by Siddhartha Gautama, who would later come to be known as Buddha, which means, you know what Buddha means? Yeah. Close. It means the enlightened one. So his name wasn't actually Buddha. That was actually a reference to the idea that he was enlightened. And became a teacher in that way, right? So Buddha, or Gautama, was born as a prince in the Shaka clan in India, but he renounced his privileged life to seek the truth about suffering and existence. So he was born into wealth, into some privilege. He said, I don't want that. That's meaningless. I want to spend my life figuring out what it means to exist and why there is suffering. So suffering and the concept of suffering within existence are a huge part of Buddhism. Trying to understand and eliminate suffering in existence, right, are big parts of that. And he famously had this kind of pivotal moment where he's sitting under a Bodhi tree, and it's almost like he has this like revelation. Right? And from that point going forward, he begins to teach these principles, right? Of kind of how we're to exist and how we're to operate within this world where suffering is a real thing. So Buddhism starts in India. It relatively quickly moves to other parts of Asia, places like Sri Lanka, China, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia. So it's well spread out through all of those areas still today, right? One of the people who was key in kind of the spread of Buddhism was a man, King Ashoka, who was an emperor in India who converted to Buddhism, and he helped spread the teachings across the empire and beyond. So in the same way kind of Constantine did for Christianity early, King Ashoka kind of does this for Buddhism, not just within India, but even beyond the borders of that. All right. Along the way, you have several different branches of Buddhism that kind of come to be. So again, we said all religions start as one idea and they quickly become different ways of approaching those ideas, right? And so that happens within Buddhism as well. And so the main branches of Buddhism that kind of emerge are Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. So all maintaining like Buddhist principle, but different ways of kind of pursuing that and working it out. So the primary teachings or the central teachings of Buddhism are called or known as the Four Noble Truths. These are kind of the four core teaching principles of the Buddha. So the Four Noble Truths, number one, dukkha, which is D-U-K-K-H-A. I can't remember if it's on your paper or not. Okay. And dukkha is this recognition that life contains suffering. I think we can all recognize that, right? That life contains suffering. Number two, samudaya, that this suffering has a cause. That suffering always has a cause. And largely that cause of suffering is craving and attachment on our part. That we are attached to physical things. We crave physical things. And that we largely do not get them, and because of that we suffer. In other words, the world is not the way we want it. And we suffer because we keep trying to make the world the way we want it. And it does not cooperate. And we suffer. Right? So the less you are attached to things, the less you suffer. So dukkha, samudaya, the next, number three, nirodha. There is an end to suffering. Right? You can live and ascend to a place where you are completely without attachment anymore, and then suffering ends. And you come back into alignment with the external reality. Right? You become what you were ultimately meant to be, one with everything. And they call that, you know what they call it? Nirvana. Right? Nirvana is achieving that highest place of enlightenment. Right? That you are free from attachment, and now there is no suffering. And then number four, MAGA. That's not Fox News MAGA. It's got two G's, right? So the MAGA tells us that there is a path to end suffering. There's a path that we can follow that if we will follow it, ultimately it will end our suffering. It'll remove all attachment, right? And that path is called the Eightfold Path, right? And we'll get to that. So understanding those four things is central to Buddhist belief. If you understand that there is suffering, and why do we suffer? Because we're attached to things we shouldn't be attached to. Like we want the world to be a way, and it's not, right? But there's a way to get outside of that, right? And that there are practices that we can undertake that will lead us in that direction. Yes, ma'am.
I think suffering also can come from
Well, yeah, and so the two causes of suffering with Buddhism would be attachment and craving, right?
Yes.
So that's what you're talking about is craving. It's craving a thing that is not, right?
Yes.
And thinking that if you got that, then
Everything would be better.
absolutely, which is delusional.
Or is.
It's delusional.
Yes.
But we all operate that way if we're not careful, right? We default to that. So number 4, MAGA, there is a path to end suffering, and that path is the eightfold path, right? So let's talk about the eightfold path just a little bit. So if you think about it this way, the eightfold path is a practical guide to ethical and mindful living. It's the way towards enlightenment. That in Buddhism, if Buddha is the enlightened one, as I follow him, I'm trying to become enlightened in the same way. How do I pursue that, right? And so the eightfold path is kind of a way to think about pursuing enlightenment. So that path breaks down into 3 categories. The first of the 3 is wisdom, right? And the word for that is prajna, Prajna, if it's not there for you. And prajna is built around this idea of right view. So I want to see things as they are. And that's coupled with right intention. So I want to live a life that has a right view to it, a proper perspective, and I want to have right intention. That I'm doing, not just doing the right things, but I'm doing them for the right reasons. Because you can do the right thing for the wrong reasons. Right? So number 1, prajna, wisdom, right view, right intention. Number 2, ethical conduct. So we're to live lives of conduct in an ethical manner, right? And the word for that is sila, S-I-L-A. So the components of that would be right speech. So the way I talk matters. The way I speak to myself, the way I speak to others, right? That I'm speaking in a way that is reflecting this concept of wanting to move towards enlightenment. So right speech, right action. That my actions should align with what I say and my intention. So right speech, right action. And the third component of ethical conduct is right livelihood. So I should find something to do in this life that allows me to live ethically. Does that make sense? Right? So that what I do matters, right? As a vocation and those kind of things. And I think inherently we know that's a bit true, right? There are jobs that I would be awful at and I would hate every day. My brother's a banker. I love my brother. I would hate being a banker, right? Nothing wrong with being a banker. It would just be wrong for me, right? And I'm pretty sure if you asked him, he's like, well, would you like to be a pastor? He'd be like, nope, not at all, right? So we all have things that I think we inherently are more right for us than other things, right? And so making sure that I'm living in a place that's right for me, right, if you will. So we have wisdom, we have ethical conduct, then number 3 is the concept of mental discipline, which is samadhi, which is S-A-M-A-D-H-I. That we, as a practicer of Buddhism, you have to build practices into your life that help you to gain mental discipline. That your mind is not disciplined on its own, right? You have to work towards that. How do I build a structure so that I live a mentally disciplined life? So the 3 components of that then would be right effort, so that I'm spending my energy and my effort in the right directions. So right effort. Second part of that would be right mindfulness. Is my mind focused on the right things? So right effort, right mindfulness, and then number 3, right concentration. Is my mind concentrated on the things that are working me towards enlightenment, right? Towards things that are servicing that path, that journey, if you will. And so you have these 3 components, 8 different kind of components within that. And these are not linear. It's not like boom, 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 boom. They kind of like just work in connection with each other, right? You don't necessarily go in order in those. All right? So that's the eightfold path. Let's talk about a couple of key concepts within Buddhism. Number 1, karma. So this is the same as within Hinduism, right? Actions have consequences. Cause and effect. That's a real thing in the universe, right? And so that's a huge guiding principle within Buddhism as well, the idea of karma. Again, you get samsara as well, so the circle of birth, death, rebirth. We see that within Buddhism as well. So again, we said these 2 started basically in the same place. There are concepts shared among them, right? So we see a little bit of that here. So samsara, the cycle of birth, death, rebirth. Next would be nirvana, which is the ultimate goal of enlightenment. It's a state of liberation and freedom from suffering. So it's not a place, it's a state, right? You don't reach it and then you go to nirvana, right? It is a state of being. It's a state of existence at some level, right? Kind of the 2 guiding philosophical concepts of Buddhism are anatta, which is A-N-A-T-T-A, which is the concept of no self, right? So this idea that we are all like part of this overarching thing, right? Existence itself. So anatta is the concept of no self. And then anicca, which is A-N-I-C-C-A, is the concept of impermanence, that we are not permanent. That when you reach nirvana, you basically go back into this like existence with everything, right? You're free of all attachment. You kind of become one with everything in some sense, right? So within Buddhism, you also have something called the 3 jewels. And these are kind of the things that are prominently pursued within it, right? Or given importance within Buddhism. So number 1 within the 3 jewels would be the Buddha. So the enlightened teacher would be first and foremost among the 3 jewels. Number 2 would be the Dharma, or the teachings. So Buddha's number 1, his teachings are number 2, the Dharma. And number 3 would be the Sangha, which is S-A-N-G-H-A. And that is the community of people who practice Buddhism. So you have Buddha as kind of the linchpin, right? Like or the first jewel there. Number 2 would be the teachings. And then number 3 would be the community. All of those work together, right? In the lives of those who follow Buddha or practice Buddhism. All right, so let's talk a little bit about types of Buddhism. We kind of mentioned these just a little bit. Let me give you a little bit more information here. So the 3 main branches of Buddhism. The first is Theravada. It is the oldest of the forms. And it's known for emphasizing monastic life and meditation. So separation from the world. Right? So if you go and you see Buddhist temples, right, and monks who have kind of given themselves to communal life within a temple or at a shrine, largely that's going to generally be those who follow Theravada, right? They're separating themselves from the world, giving themselves to pursuit of enlightenment in that kind of community. So number one, Theravada. Number two, Mahayana. Which really focuses on compassion. And so it's much more involved in how do we bring an end to suffering around us, right? So if you think about it, Theravada is kind of we get away from the suffering of the outside world to focus on enlightenment, whereas Mahayana exists much more in how do we actually help others around us in terms of alleviating suffering. And then the third is Vajrayana, which is known as the diamond path. And it's known because it incorporates like very pronounced ritual and esoteric practice. So again, all three of these follow the base teachings of Buddha. They just interpret them a little differently. So let's talk a little bit about some common Buddhist practices. So some of them we are familiar with, at least in concept, right? Meditation. So again, this idea of being able to bring mentally your mind into a place where you're centered and focused on not all the attachments of this life, but the divine, are a huge component of Buddhist practice. Chanting as well, which again is a way of centering mind and heart and soul and all of those kind of things. And then mindfulness, being aware of your thoughts, right? Taking control of your thoughts, right? Centering your thoughts are huge components of Buddhist practice. Some of the other things within that would be something like the puja, which is offerings, which are given to the temples, right? Or given to the poor, depending on your practice, right? So how do the monks live at the temples? How do they support themselves? People give offerings, right? They come and give offerings at the temple, at the shrine. That's used for the livelihood and the food, the life of the monks and those who are part of that ritual or part of that shrine, part of that temple. There is a very large component of Buddhism that is focused on monastic life. It is a huge part of those communities in many places. But there is also a huge focus on lay practice. It's not just the monks. And in fact, Buddhist monks are not necessarily seen as religious leaders, right? They don't necessarily lead a lot of religious practice for lay people. And so they're not priests in the way that we think about that necessarily most of the time, right? They are just those who've given themselves to this complete service, right? This pursuit of enlightenment. And so they largely will do very menial tasks around temples and shrines, right? They clean them. They do all that stuff. It's not necessarily that they're there to lead the religious practices all the time. So it's a little bit different in that way. Some significant Buddhist festivals, you may have heard of one or two of these. Vesak, which celebrates Buddha's birth, his enlightenment, and his death. Right? So,
Is Buddha their God?
No, not really.
Okay.
He would be their model, I would say is a better way to think about that. Right? So one of the things that is very different about Buddhism from Hinduism is that Hinduism has, said this earlier, millions of gods. Buddhism has none. There's not really a God in Buddhism, right? We're all part of the divine, right? We're all trying to work back towards the divine, if you will, right? But there is not really a God in that way, And so it's pretty unique among the major religions in that there's not really a central God to it, right? Or a God at all in that sense. So it is a bit different there, right? So we said that for a lot of its existence, Buddhism was relatively narrowly confined within the Asian subcontinent, the Indian subcontinent, and South Asia, right? But like other religions, over the last, especially 100 to 150 years, it has become much more global. A lot of that is movement of people who are practicing Buddhism. There are relatively prominent people in the modern day who we know that are practitioners of Buddhism. The most famous would be Steve Jobs. Yeah, he would be the most famous in America. The Dalai Lama, right? Like so there are people who we would know who are pretty famous, who are practitioners of Buddhism. Yeah, Buddhism had a real resurgence, what, about like 20 or 30 years ago, especially on the West Coast? Right, California, like Hollywood, there are a lot of people being Buddhist all of a sudden, right? I like to think it's because there is no God in Buddhism. So Buddhism basically tells you at some level that you are a God. You just have to start acting like it. I think that is really like a pretty easy sell to a lot of people in our culture. I always felt like I was a God. You know what I mean? So, I think Buddhism is a much easier sell in America than like Hinduism and some others, right? Like, it's like, oh, I thought I was a God. I always felt like that. Now I just have to act like it. And I have to be nice to people and all that stuff. Yeah. Let's see. I think that's about it.
So they reject God?
No. They think, in some sense, they think that all that exists is divine. Right? And that at some level, like suffering exists in the world. We talked about this a little bit. Suffering exists because we refuse to recognize what is. And we're trying to change what is to what we want it to be. And that is the way of suffering. Right? If we could just come to terms with the way that things were meant to be and are, then that's exactly what it should be. Right? And so everything is divine to them. You're divine. I'm divine. Right? The chair is divine. And I'm not making fun. I'm not demeaning it there. They have a sense that everything is part of that, right? It's not a rejection of God. It's just a different concept of what the divine is, right? They don't see it as a singular being in the way that we do, right? That God is an actual being, right? One being, three persons, all that. Like, they see everything that is as divine, right? So it's just a little different. It's a different way to look at it, I guess. Yeah.
I think I'll stay with Christianity.
That's fair.
I like that idea.
You don't get to be a God in Christianity. You have to. So, Steve?
Yeah, you had mentioned that there are about 2.5 billion people who practice Christianity. How many people practice Buddhism versus Hinduism?
So Hindu is a little bit over 1 billion. Buddhism is about 500,000. So it's like 530. Hinduism is like 1.01. So it's about half the size of Hinduism in terms of practitioners, people who follow it. So, but they are the third and fourth largest religions in the world, right? Only behind Islam and Christianity. So, and they are much more practiced in the parts of the world than Christianity is, or even Islam. I mean, if you go to India, Nepal, right? Those are 80 to 90% Hindu. It's very hard to be a Christian or very hard to be a Muslim, especially. Like, Islam has not taken off in India and Nepal. There's a reason, because the Hindus kill them. Like, there's real, like, violence being done towards Christians and Muslims, especially Muslims, it seems like lately in India, right? They don't play well together. And so, so if you think about the two largest nations on earth are China, India. And I think India is larger, right? Is India larger population-wise? I think it might be a little bit larger. I could be wrong on that. It's one of the two, right? One of the two. So what are the predominant religions in the two largest countries in the world? They're pretty important in terms of the way the world actually operates, even though they're not as large as the others. They hold very key majorities in the world, right? And so just having a sense of that and knowing kind of what guides them, I think really matters to us, right? To understand how the world works and how it operates. So anyway, any other questions about Buddhism before we get out of here? Yes, sir.
Well, just kind of thinking through like Romans 16. Paul's talking about, he names off like, hey, this is the first guy from Asia to follow Christ.
Mm-hmm.
I've never really thought through of like the likelihood of that person being raised in one of these two.
Mm-hmm.
What is there something you like?
I don't think we could say certainly, but I'm sure that at least some of the ideas had permeated the part of the world where Christianity arrived, right? Was it Thomas who historically was killed in India? It was Thomas who, like tradition says that, right? Whether it happened or not, we don't know, but yep, yep. So we know that relatively early on, Christianity made its way to the Indian subcontinent, right? To the point that people died in that, right? People died taking the gospel very early on into those parts of the world, where these things where these religions were the majority and continue to be. So, so these have long historic interactions, conflicts, right, at times. So, and I think we don't think about that sometimes. We kind of think they were just all on their own. And no, like, all of these religions came from a relatively small part of the earth, right? It wasn't spread out very much. They kind of originated in the very same places. So that's an interesting thing to think about to me, right? That the guiding religions of the world today largely all came out of Asia between 1,500 and 3,000 years ago, right? It's pretty interesting that out of that period of time in that relatively small space of the earth, that has been these have been the guiding ideas up until the time that we live in and continue to be, which is pretty fascinating to think about. So anyway, any other questions about Buddhism before we get out of here? Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would think, I think they would say, so for instance, like someone gets sick and it's suffering that's beyond their control. Someone gets, so God forbid, a kid gets early onset cancer. Who caused that suffering? We don't know. And I think the way they look at that is the world itself has suffering, but part of the suffering we have with that is I want this to not be the way that it is. So acceptance is the way out of suffering. Does that, you know what I mean? I just have to accept the way that it is. Stop trying to make it the way I want it to be, even in that kind of thing, right? And I think the whole idea is if everybody moves and continues to move to, and we get to this place of enlightenment and complete nirvana, all of those things will then cease to exist. Does that make sense? Then that kind of suffering will go away, right? So I don't know that they have a really, and again, this is my ignorance. So they could, I don't know that their theology of suffering satisfies us necessarily. I don't know that my own theology of suffering satisfies me, right? Because if someone asked me the same question, why do kids get cancer? I don't know. It's awful. It's awful. Why do all of these horrible things happen? I don't know. Right? What I do know is it's not because God is not good, right? Like he's good. But there's something about humans that for some reason we keep acting in ways that compound suffering. They don't lessen it. As a species, we compound it for some reason. And so I think Buddha was trying to say, hey, listen, this is the reality of the world. How do we live lives that actually don't compound the suffering, but they lessen it? How do we live that way? I think that's what he was trying to do, right? And I think that's what they're trying to figure out through this. And it's probably a good question for us to ask as Christians too. Are we living lives that actually bring healing to the world and don't increase the pain of it? I don't know if I always live that way. I think sometimes I'm part of the suffering, part of the pain, right? I'm not helping it. So I think it's actually a really good question to ask no matter what your religious system is. Am I actually helping heal the world? Or am I actually further damaging it in the way that I live? And that has all kind of connotations in it, right? Like, I think one of the things that has always struck me as a Christian, and I grew up in a tradition where I always say that they treated the earth like a rental car, right? Because everybody was waiting on the rapture to get out of here. So they really didn't seem to care if the world suffered at all, right? Like it was like, oh, this is going to burn anyway, right? It's like, let's drive it hard while we got it. You know what I mean? And to me, I always felt disconnected from that a little bit. Partly is because I don't think we're getting out of here. I think God's going to come and make it what it was meant to be. Like, I think that's the way forward. But it also seemed like from the beginning, God took pretty seriously that we as his followers, we as his people, were meant to care for his creation, to be stewards of it, right? And we can talk about how to do that. I don't want to get into the politics of the global warming and all that noise, right? Like, we can argue about that stuff. But I think the thing that's really clear is we should be a people who are part of healing the world, not doing more damage, right? To the people of the world, to the creation itself, all levels of it. And I hope that as people of God, we are getting back to that place where we're not just treating the world and its people like a rental car that we get to get rid of, you know, and I don't have to worry about it because it's not mine. I hope that we're kind of moving away from that in American Christianity, because I think we did it for a long time, right? And I don't think it's helped the way other people perceive us very much. I think it's been problematic. So I think there are some things that we can learn from Buddhists. I think there's some things that we can learn from Hindus, right? I think there's some things maybe they could learn from us as well. So that's why we do nights like this. That's why I do it, right? Because I want to understand people and not just hold the worst stereotypes about things. And part of that is born out of conversations with other followers of Jesus sometimes. I don't know if you ever have this conversation with other Christians. You're like, what did you say? And I think I'm a huge believer that if our faith is as important as we say it is, we should do everything we can do to understand it as much as we can. God has given us so much to be able to understand so much of this. I think our responsibility is to do that. And so anything we can do as a church to help you guys do that is what we should do, right? And so if these nights help, I hope they do. More than giving you answers, I hope they inspire curiosity. Hope they make you want to get more answers and have better questions and love people better. So anyway, no more questions? Cool. I did a great job then. Or I did an awful job and you guys were just really nice. So either way, I'll take it. All right. I'll pray and we will get out of here and have a wonderful week. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for the opportunity to sit down and to just think together, to talk together. I hope that this was time well spent. I know that there are a lot of people around the world who are doing their best to figure out what is true and to figure out what you're like. And for whatever reason, Lord, we were born in a place and we grew up under systems that allowed us to know you. And how grateful I am for that. But how much I also want everybody to know you. And so, Father, may nights like this be nights of equipping to help us to have conversations that are respectful and honorable, but also recognize the importance of introducing people to you. And so, Father, would you give us wisdom to do that? Would you give us hearts that long to see other people find the hope that we found in you? May we love you well. May we love each other well. As we go this week, may you be glorified in all that we do. Lord, it's in Jesus' name I pray.